A boy is 7 years old. Tonight, he will not sleep in his mother's house again. He does not know it yet, but the life he has known is already over. What if a society decided, on purpose, to break its own children circumflex euros, so that nothing in the world could ever break them again? That is not a metaphor, that is a policy, a law, a way of life that lasted for centuries. The Spartans did not stumble into courage. They engineered it, the same way an army today engineers a weapon circumflex euros, through pain, repetition, and design. And by the end of this film, you will understand exactly how they did it, what it cost them, and why almost every fact you think you know about Sparta is only half true. Ancient Greece was a world of city-states, constantly competing circumflex euros, Athens with its philosophers, Corinth with its trade, Thebes with its shifting alliances. And then there was Sparta, a city with no great temples, no great art, almost no writing of its own. Sparta left behind no epic poems bragging about itself. It didn't need to. Its reputation walked into a room before its soldiers did. For nearly 300 years, no army in Greece wanted to face Spartan hoplites in open battle, not because Sparta had more soldiers. It usually didn't. Not because of better weapons. Every Greek city used similar bronze and iron. Sparta's advantage was something far harder to build and far scarier to fight: certainty. Spartan soldiers were trained to believe, without hesitation, that retreat was worse than death. How do you build that kind of mind into a human being? That question is the entire story of this documentary, circumflex euros, and the answer begins before a Spartan boy could even talk. Chapter 1. A city built on fear of its own people. To understand Spartan warriors, you first have to understand something uncomfortable. Sparta's entire military culture was built out of fear. Sometime around the 8th century BCE, Sparta conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and turned its population into a class of forced laborers called helots. Historians estimate helots outnumbered full Spartan citizens by roughly 7-1. That single number explains almost everything that came after. A tiny ruling class, sitting on top of a much larger population that despised them, cannot afford weakness. If Spartan citizens ever looked soft, disorganized, or divided, they risked a helot uprising that could end their entire society overnight. So Sparta made a decision most other Greek cities never had to make. Every single citizen from childhood would be turned into a soldier. Not because Sparta wanted to conquer the world. Because Sparta was terrified of losing control of the one it already had. This is where the myths need a correction. Sparta is often remembered as a warrior paradise built for glory. The historical reality is colder. Spartan militarism functioned as a survival mechanism for a minority ruling over an enslaved majority. The famous discipline wasn't only about winning wars abroad circumflex euros. It was crowd control at home, wearing armor. So what happens to a child born into a system built entirely around that fear? Chapter 2. Circumflex euros. The inspection that decided everything. According to the ancient biographer Plutarch, writing centuries after the events he describes, a Spartan infant was brought before a council of elders shortly after birth. The elders inspected the child for signs of weakness or deformity. Here is where fact and myth must be separated carefully. Plutarch claims that infants judged unfit were left exposed at a place called the Apothete, a chasm near Mount Taygetus, to die. Modern historians are divided on this. Some archaeological and skeletal evidence from the region has been interpreted as supporting the practice. Other historians argue Plutarch was writing propaganda, exaggerating Spartan brutality to make a moral point to Roman readers centuries later. and that the story may be partly or wholly myth. What we can say with confidence, based on multiple ancient sources, is this: Spartan society placed extraordinary value on physical capability from the very first days of life, and a child's worth to the state was evaluated almost immediately after birth. Contrast that with Athens, just 80 miles away, where philosophy, poetry, and debate were prized above physical perfection. Two neighboring cultures, two completely different definitions of human value. Sparta had already decided, before a child took its first breath of independent air, what kind of person that city needed it to become. But surviving the inspection was only round one. The real transformation hadn't even started. Chapter 3 A circumflex euros, taken from home AT7. At age 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his family and placed into a state-run education and training system called the agoge. This is one of the few parts of Spartan life we have strong historical confirmation for, referenced by multiple ancient writers including Xenophon, who actually lived in Sparta for a time. The agoge was not a school in the way we understand school. It was closer to a controlled environment of engineered hardship. Boys were organized into small groups called herds, where older boys supervised younger ones, and where competition between boys was constant and encouraged. Food was deliberately kept insufficient. Historical accounts describe boys being pushed toward hunger so they would learn to steal food a circumflex euros, and if caught stealing, they were punished not for the theft itself, but for getting caught. The lesson embedded in that single rule is staggering. It wasn't cheating that was shameful. Getting caught was. Think about what that teaches a developing mind. Cleverness, risk tolerance, and the ability to operate under scarcity were rewarded. Getting exposed, getting seen as incapable, was the actual crime. Spartan boys were being trained, years before they ever held a weapon, to endure discomfort as a normal condition of life rather than an emergency. Clothing was minimal, even in winter. Boys often went barefoot to toughen their feet for marching over any terrain. Sleeping arrangements were simple beds of reeds the boys gathered themselves, with no cushioning allowed. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, from Sparta's perspective. It was calibration. A soldier who has never been cold, hungry, or in pain will panic the first time battle brings all three at once. A soldier who has lived inside that discomfort since childhood barely notices it. But there was one part of this training that went even further than physical hardship a circumflex euros, and it targeted something far more personal: fear itself. Chapter 4 A circumflex euros, training fear out of the human body. Modern psychology gives us language the Spartans never had, but the mechanism they were using is one we now understand clearly. Repeated controlled exposure to stress reduces the brain's fear response over time. This is the same principle behind modern exposure therapy, used today to treat phobias and combat-related trauma a circumflex euros, except Sparta was applying it deliberately, at scale, to an entire citizen population, starting in childhood. Spartan boys were regularly placed into competitive, physically demanding, and sometimes violent contests with each other. One ritual, described by ancient sources, involved boys competing in organized fights that could turn brutal, occasionally resulting in serious injury, sanctioned by the state as part of training. This is confirmed practice, not myth, though the exact frequency and severity likely varied and were later exaggerated in retelling. The purpose wasn't sadism. It was habituation. A nervous system exposed early and repeatedly to controlled danger doesn't stop feeling fear a circumflex euros. No human biology allows that a circumflex euros, but it does learn to function while afraid instead of freezing. That distinction is the actual secret behind Spartan battlefield reputation. Spartans were not fearless in the way movies portray them. They were trained to act correctly while feeling fear, which looks identical to fearlessness from the outside, but is, biologically, something else entirely: regulation. This is also where the famous Spartan motto comes from, a circumflex euros, though it's important to be precise about it. The idea that a Spartan mother told her son to come home, with his shield or on it, appears in Plutarch's writings, compiled centuries after the classical period, drawing on oral traditions. We cannot verify individual mothers said these exact words. What we can verify is that Spartan culture, through its institutions, consistently reinforced the idea that dying in formation was honorable, and fleeing was the only true disgrace. Which raises the next question. How do you make an entire army actually believe that? Belief that's strong doesn't come from training the body alone. Chapter 5 A circumflex euros, the psychology of the phalanx. Spartan soldiers fought in a formation called the phalanx, a circumflex euros, a tight wall of men, shields overlapping, spears extended, moving and fighting as a single unit rather than as individuals. This formation wasn't unique to Sparta. Most Greek city-states used variations of it. What made Sparta different was execution, and the reason for that difference is psychological, not technological. In a phalanx, your shield does not only protect you, it protects the man to your left. If you break formation and run, you don't just endanger yourself, a circumflex euros. You expose your neighbor's unprotected side to enemy spears. Every soldier's survival was physically linked to the courage of the man beside him. This created something psychologists today would recognize as engineered social cohesion. Spartan soldiers trained together from childhood, ate together in communal messes as adults, and were organized into small units where the men fighting beside you in battle were often the same men you had grown up with in the agoge. Fear of personal death is powerful. But research on combat psychology, going back to studies of soldiers in the 20th century, consistently shows that fear of failing your unit and letting down the men beside you is often a stronger motivator than fear of death itself. Sparta had, functionally, discovered and institutionalized this principle roughly 2,500 years before modern military psychologists put a name to it. This is also why Spartan discipline in retreat became so legendary. Most ancient armies, when they broke completely, a circumflex euros. Panic spreading through a crowd is contagious, and men would drop weapons and run in every direction. Spartan units were trained to retreat in formation when necessary, still facing the enemy, still protecting each other. An army that can retreat without collapsing is, paradoxically, far more dangerous than an army that can only charge forward. All of this had been building toward one moment in history that would prove a circumflex euros, or shatter a circumflex euros, everything Sparta had built. Chapter 6 A circumflex euros Thermopylae, the test. In 480 BCE, a massive Persian army under King Xerxes invaded Greece. Ancient sources, particularly the historian Herodotus, give Persian troop numbers in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians generally consider these figures inflated, as was common in ancient accounts of enemy forces. What is agreed upon is that the Persian force vastly outnumbered the Greek defenders, a circumflex euros, likely by a factor of at least 10 to 1, possibly far more. King Leonidas of Sparta led a force that included around 300 Spartan soldiers, along with several thousand allied Greek troops, to block the Persian advance at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. The geography mattered enormously. The pass was narrow enough that Persian numerical superiority could not be fully applied, a circumflex euros. Only a limited number of soldiers could physically engage the Greek line at once. For 2 days, the vastly outnumbered Greek force held. This is confirmed historical fact, not legend. The Spartan phalanx, reinforced by the terrain, repelled wave after wave of Persian attacks. On the third day, according to Herodotus, a local resident named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to outflank the Greek position from behind. Facing certain encirclement, most of the allied Greek forces withdrew. Leonidas and his remaining Spartans, along with a small number of other troops who chose to stay, did not. They knew at that point that survival was no longer possible. And they fought anyway. Chapter 7 A circumflex Euros, why they did not run. This is the question that sits at the emotional center of the entire Spartan story, and it deserves a real answer, not just a dramatic one. From a purely tactical standpoint, staying made sense on one level. A rearguard action could slow the Persian advance and buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defense, which historically it did. But tactics alone don't fully explain why hundreds of men chose certain death over an available retreat. The deeper answer lies in everything covered so far in this documentary. These men had spent their entire lives, since age 7, inside a system that made retreat psychologically more painful than death. Shame, in Spartan culture, was not treated as a minor social discomfort. It was treated as a fate worse than dying, reinforced through decades of ritual, training, and community identity. A Spartan who survived by running from Thermopylae would have returned to a society with no place for him, a circumflex Euros, stripped of citizenship rights, socially exiled, a walking symbol of failure in a culture that had no tolerance for it. Given that reality, staying and fighting was not necessarily an act of superhuman fearlessness. It may have been, for men shaped this way since childhood, the psychologically easier choice. That reframing doesn't make their courage less remarkable a circumflex Euros. If anything, it makes it more understandable and more human. They weren't born without fear. Sparta had spent their entire lives building a world where death held less power over them than disgrace did. Leonidas and his men were eventually killed to the last soldier. The battle, in purely military terms, was a Persian victory. Xerxes' army marched onward into Greece. But something unexpected happened next a circumflex Euros, something that turned a military defeat into one of the most powerful pieces of psychological warfare in ancient history. Chapter 8 A circumflex Euros, the defeat that won the war. News of Thermopylae spread through the Greek world within weeks, and it did something no Greek city-state alliance had managed to do before. It united fractured, competing cities under a shared sense of purpose. The story of a small force choosing death over retreat became a rallying symbol for Greek resistance against Persia. Later that same year, a combined Greek fleet defeated the Persians decisively at the Battle of Salamis. The following year, Greek land forces defeated the remaining Persian army at the Battle of Plataea. Historians widely agree that the psychological impact of Thermopylae a circumflex Euros, the demonstration that Greek soldiers would rather die than yield a circumflex Euros, played a real role in stiffening Greek resolve during the following campaigns, even though Thermopylae itself was a tactical loss. This is the paradox sitting underneath the entire Spartan legend. Their most famous victory was actually a defeat, and yet it accomplished something a victory might not have. It proved, in the most extreme circumstance imaginable, that the system Sparta had built actually worked exactly as designed, all the way to its final, fatal conclusion. Here is the answer to the question this documentary opened with. Sparta did not create fearless warriors by removing fear. That was never actually possible, and it was never actually the goal. Sparta created warriors who had been trained since the age of 7 to fear something else more than death, failure, shame, and the collapse of the group they belonged to. Every institution circumflex euros, the childhood inspections, the agode, the deliberate hunger, the sanctioned violence between boys, the communal meals, the phalanx formation itself circumflex euros, was a piece of a single engineered system designed to move death lower on a soldier's list of fears than dishonor. That is not superhuman courage. It is, in the coldest and most accurate sense, social engineering applied with total consistency for hundreds of years on an entire citizen class. And it worked precisely because it never tried to fight human psychology. It worked with it circumflex euros, rearranging what a Spartan soldier was actually afraid of, rather than pretending fear didn't exist at all. The unsettling truth Sparta leaves behind is this: courage is not a fixed trait some people are born with and others aren't. Courage is, to a significant degree, built by the environment a person is raised inside. What a culture punishes, rewards, and normalizes from childhood quietly decides what its people will be willing to endure and what they'll be terrified to become. Sparta paid an enormous price for this. Its population never grew large. Its economy stayed rigid. Its treatment of the Helot population was built on brutal, sustained oppression, and eventually, weakened by shrinking citizen numbers and unable to adapt, Sparta's military dominance faded entirely by the 3rd century BCE. The very system that made Spartans so formidable in battle was too rigid to let Sparta survive as a lasting power. Fear-built strength, it turns out, has an expiration date that glory alone can't extend. A boy walked out of his mother's house at 7 years old and never fully returned to the life he had known. What waited for him instead was hunger, competition, cold, pain, and an entire society quietly convincing him that none of that mattered as much as standing his ground beside the men next to him. Centuries later, we still remember his name circumflex euros, even though we never actually learn it. We remember what he became, not because he felt no fear at all, but because an entire civilization spent his whole childhood teaching him exactly where to point it. Sparta is gone. Its walls, famously, were never even built circumflex euros. The city relied on its soldiers as its only defense, and for hundreds of years that was enough. In the end, it wasn't military technology or wealth or population that made Sparta legendary. It was a single, brutal, effective idea that a human being's deepest fears can be reshaped deliberately from childhood circumflex euros for better and for a very heavy worse. That idea outlived the city that built it, and it is still the reason the world remembers Sparta today.